The sea never sleeps, and by the year 1629, it has already claimed more men than anyone could count. And here, on the deck of the Batavia, you begin to wonder if it has set its eyes on you. The salt stings your lips, as it strips what little moisture you have left on them. The sails groan overhead, straining against the wind. The ship is massive, 40 metres of creaking oak, tar and hemp. One of the pride vessels of the Dutch East India Company. To the merchants and investors back in Amsterdam, she is just a floating chest of gold, carrying silver coins and precious cargo, destined for the Indies. But to you, pressed shoulder to shoulder with more than 300 others, she is a prison. A floating world of sweat, filth and fear. You can smell it before you can see it. The stench of the unwashed bodies crammed below deck. The reek of sickness in the airless dark. Children whimper in the blackness. Mothers trying to hush them as the timber creaks and the water drips through the seams. Rats scurry across your bare feet. The air is thick with rot, spoiled rations, stagnant water, and the sour tang of vomit. You gag, but there's no escape. Above deck, the world is no kinder. The officers bark orders, strutting in fine boots while sailors curse under their breath. The hierarchy is iron. Captain, merchants, soldiers, sailors, passengers. Everyone knows their place, and everyone hates it. Even the sea seems divided. Calm one moment, raging the next, hurling winds that crash over the gunwales and leave you clinging to the rigging, praying to God you don't go overboard. The voyage has barely begun, but already the cracks are showing. Men whisper about Jeronimus Cornelisz, a merchant with sharp eye and a tongue dipped in honey. He says captain is weak. He says the company is rotten. He speaks of freedom, of riches, of taking what should be ours. Dangerous words. But out here, 1,000 miles from land, words have power. And then there's the captain himself, Francisco Pelsert. Stern, sickly, more scholar than sailor. He commands respect with his title, not his strength. The crew know it, the passengers sense it, and the sea, merciless, eternal, seems to mock him. Tonight the wind rises, the Batavia rolls and shudders, her timbers groan as if it's in pain. Lanterns swing wildly in the gloom, throwing shadows that make the ship seem alive. You cling to the railing, knuckles white, staring into the inky black waves. Somewhere out there, beyond the darkness, lies reefs sharp enough to rip a hull apart. You whisper a prayer, though you know it won't matter. The sea doesn't listen. The sea only takes. Behind you a child begins to scream. Somewhere below a man coughs up blood. The officers shout. The sails strain. The storm builds, and in the pit of your stomach you feel it. The crawling dread that tells you something is about to happen. Something worse than the storm. Worse than sickness. Worse than the sea itself. Because on this voyage, it will not be the ocean that destroys you. It will be the men. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Dark History Podcast, where we explore the darkest parts of human history. I hope you're all doing well. I'm Rob, your host as always. You're listening to Season 4, Episode 15. We've travelled through the blood-soaked streets of medieval Italy, through the plague-ridden alleyways of London, and into the shadows of forgotten prisons. But today, we're leaving the land behind, and stepping onto the deck of a ship bound for the other side of the world. This is not just any ship. This is the Batavia, the pride of the Dutch East India Company. She was built to carry wealth, soldiers and settlers across half the globe, from the chilly harbours of Amsterdam to the sweltering colonies of the East Indies. Her voyage in 1629 was meant to be routine, profitable, safe. Instead, it turned into one of the most infamous shipwrecks in history. Now, shipwrecks weren't unusual in the 17th century. The seas between Europe and Asia were littered with the bones of vessels claimed by storms, reefs and pirates. But what sets the Batavia apart isn't the wreck itself. It's what came after. Because when the hull splintered on the reef off the coast of Australia, and hundreds of survivors scrambled onto a barren island, what followed was not rescue, but carnage. Imagine this. More than 300 souls stranded. No fresh water, no food, but what the sea might yield. And in that desperate silence, one man rose to power. Not the captain, not the admiral. A failed apothecary named Jeronimus Cornelisz. He saw opportunity in the chaos, and what he built was a reign of terror that claimed the lives of over 100 men, women and children. Executions, massacre, enslavement, murder for sport. This is one of the darkest tales ever recorded at sea. A story not just of survival, but of cruelty. The thin line between order and madness, and how quickly it can be crossed when the world falls away. So settle yourselves, pour a drink, or if you're listening at night, draw the curtain, because this isn't just a shipwreck story. It's a story of mutiny, mass murder, and the depths that people will sink when left alone on the edge of the world. And with that, let's climb aboard the Batavia and sail into one of history's most chilling voyages. Gather close to the fire. It's time for more dark history. The Batavia left the Dutch Republic on the 29th of October 1628, setting out from Texel on what should have been a triumphant voyage. She was the jewel in the Dutch East India Company, a grand East Indiaman built to carry men, munitions and precious cargo to the East Indies. In her hold lay silver worth 250,000 guilders, enough to fund armies, colonies and palaces. On board were 341 souls, sailors hardened by years at sea, soldiers bound to service in the Indies, merchants guarding their fortune, and passengers, including women and children, who hoped for a new life abroad. But the company was ruthless, and comfort was not part of the bargain. Below deck, the passengers lived in hell. Space was scarce, families were cramped into airless compartments, sleeping on rough boards, surrounded by lice, fleas and rats. Buckets overflowed with waste. The air was foul, choking with human stench. The sick coughed and wheezed. The healthy prayed they wouldn't join them. Pregnant women struggled in the heat. Infants wailed in the dark, their cries drowned out by the groans of the ship. The food was no better. Hardtack biscuits crawling with weevils, salted meat that stank of rot, barrels of water that after weeks grew slimy and green. Men forced down every mouthful, gagging, because to refuse was to starve. Scurvy bloomed across the crew, gums swelling, teeth loosened, sores opening up across skin. Some men could barely stand, others died quietly, rolled overboard with no ceremony. And yet, on deck, the tension was worse. The Batavia was commanded by Francisco Pelsart, a company man of intelligence and learning, but not of health. He was frail and prone to sickness, more bureaucrat than seaman. His skipper, Arian Jacobs, despised him, a hard-drinking sailor with little patience for authority. Their relationship was poisonous, marked by quarrels and resentment. Into this rift stepped Jeronimus Cornelisz. Cornelisz was an outsider, a failed apothecary from Haarlem, fleeing scandal after the death of his child and the ruin of his business. He had charm, sharp eyes, soft words, and mind skills in persuasion. He attached himself to Jacobs, fanning his hatred for Pelsart, and he began to whisper at mutiny. The plan was simple, at least in theory. Seize the ship, kill Pelsart and his officers, throw the loyalists overboard, and make off with the silver to Madagascar, where they could live as pirates and kings. The promise of riches drew in followers, soldiers embittered by hardship, sailors beaten down by discipline, men who felt the company offered nothing but misery. But timing was everything. The mutineers needed the right moment. Until then, they kept their knives sheathed, their anger hidden, and then came the night of the 4th of June, 1629. The Batavia, sailing through treacherous waters off the coast of Western Australia, struck into what is today Morning Reef. The crash tore through the ship like thunder. Timbers creaked, water gushed in. In the darkness, panic erupted. Passengers screamed as the decks tilted. Lanterns fell and smashed. Men scrambled for ladders. Women clutched children. Sailors shouted over the roar of the surf. Some were crushed by the falling mast. Others were swept into the sea, their cries lost to the black waves. Horses, carried as cargo, were thrown against walls of their pens, breaking bones before drowning. Chests of silver shifted and toppled, crushing the unlucky. By dawn, the great ship was breaking apart. Those who could swim struck out for the nearby islands. The low, barren stretches of sand and coral, the largest of these, later called Beacon Island. Others clung to the wreckage, kicking desperately towards shore. The sea was thick with debris, planks, barrels and bodies. When the sun rose, the survivors counted themselves. Around 280 had made it, but they had washed up on a desolate island with no trees, no fresh water and little food. The wreck still lay on the reef, but every hour the waves pounded it further into splinters. Pelsart made a fateful decision. Taking Jacobs, a handful of sailors and one of the lifeboats, he set out to reach the port of Batavia, nearly 3,000 kilometers away, to bring help. It was a desperate gamble. For the survivors left behind, it meant weeks, maybe months without leadership, without supplies, alone on barren coral sand. And in that vacuum of power, Jeronimus Cornelisz stepped forward. Cornelisz saw the wreck not as a disaster, but as an opportunity. With Pelsart gone, there was no one to challenge him. He gathered men around him, loyalists, malcontents, and anyone hungry for power. Then he began his rule. First, he disarmed the survivors. Soldiers were ordered to surrender their weapons for the safety of all. In truth, the swords and muskets were locked away, leaving only Cornelisz's followers, armed. Then came the food. Bread salvaged from the wreck, barrels of water, salted meat, and whatever scraps could be recovered. Cornelisz claimed it all. He doled it out at his command, and men quickly learned that obedience meant survival. Hunger became his sharpest blade. But food was not the only threat. Fresh water was everything. One group of men, sent to scout the nearby island, stumbled on a spring. When they returned, Cornelisz feigned interest and praised their efforts. But in private, he whispered orders. Those men never saw the sun rise again. They were taken aside, strangled or stabbed, their bodies left where the crabs could finish them off. Anyone who found hope outside of his control was a dead man. Then the killings began in earnest. At first they were hidden. Men were sent out on flimsy rafts, told to paddle to better islands, only to vanish into the surf. Groups marched off in search of food, were abandoned to starve. But soon, Cornelisz stopped pretending. Survivors later testified that Beacon's Island turned into a butcher's yard. Soldiers who resisted were cut down with swords, their throats slit and their bodies left by the gulls to pick clean. Children were drowned in the shallows or strangled with ribbons. Women were dragged from their shelters, stripped and handed out to Cornelisz's officers. One woman, Lucretia Jens, later described how she was forced to endure repeated assaults while her captors laughed. At night the screams echoed across the sand. No one slept. Killing became a ritual. Cornelisz convened councils where accusations were fabricated. This one's a thief, that one's a traitor. The condemned were dragged out, pleading for their lives, only to be stabbed, beaten or strangled. The coral sand ran dark with blood, and the gulls grew fat. It escalated into a right massacre. On one day alone, Cornelisz ordered the killing of 40 men, women and children. Witnesses spoke of heads being struck from bodies with axes, of mothers slain as they clutched their infants, of toddlers hurled onto rocks. One soldier later confessed to cutting a boy's throat just to prove his loyalty. Another said he drowned a young girl in the shallows, pressing her face under the water until she stopped struggling. Cornelisz himself rarely killed with his own hands. He preferred to watch, to direct, to test his men's obedience by forcing them into blood. But he encouraged the cruelty, smiling faintly as men cut throats or drowned children. Those left alive endured humiliation and terror. Women were forced into concubinage, dressed in stolen silks from the wreck and paraded like trophies. Some were passed between men like spoils of war. Survivors later said it was worse than the killing. The living wished they'd joined the dead. Hunger made it worse still. Seabirds were eaten raw. Men chewed strips of leather or gnawed on coral until their gums bled. The smell of death clung to the island, mingling with the salt spray and the stench of sweat and fear. The terror lasted for weeks. By the time Pelsart returned, more than 120 people had been murdered. The survivors spoke of Beacon's Island as a place cursed by the devil himself. On a neighbouring island known as West Wallaby Island, far from Beacon's horror, a group of soldiers under a Frisian corporal named Weber Hayes had done the unthinkable. They had survived. Sent away by Cornelisz, in hopes they would die of thirst, they had instead found fresh water and food. They had built a fort of coral stone, armed themselves with improvised pikes and clubs, and prepared to fight back. When Cornelisz sent raiding parties to finish them, Hayes and his men beat them back. Against all odds, they had resisted. When Pelsart's rescue ship finally arrived, it was Hayes who raced to shore, waving signals, shouting warnings. He told the commander everything, The murders, the rapes, the massacre. Without Hayes, Cornelisz might have seized the rescue ship and escaped with a fortune. Instead, he was caught and his kingdom of sand collapsed overnight. Cornelisz and his lieutenants were seized. Some fought, others begged. The survivors demanded justice, and on those very islands, the gallows were built. The executions were swift and brutal. Several mutineers had their right hands chopped off before they were hanged. Cornelisz, ever the schemer, tried to claim madness, saying fate had driven him to do it. He pleaded for mercy, but Pelsart would not listen. His hands were bound, and his body was broken on the wheel, and finally, he was hanged. His head was displayed as a warning. Others met similar ends, strangled by rope, twisted in the salty wind, while the survivors watched, their bodies left for the gulls. Justice, in the eyes of the Dutch East India Company, had been served. Not all mutineers were executed. Two young men, Waterloos and Jan Pelgrim, were considered too young to be killed, but too dangerous to keep. They were marooned on the Australian mainland, with a few supplies, and left to their fate. No trace of them was ever found. Some say they perished in the bush. Others whispered they may have lived among the Aboriginal people. Their end remains a mystery. Arjen Jacobs, the skipper who had conspired with Cornelisz, escaped the gallows, but not justice. He was shipped back to Batavia in chains. There he disappeared into the prison records, likely dying behind bars, forgotten by all but history. Francisco Pelsart, the commander, returned to Batavia hailed as a man who had restored order, but his triumph was short-lived. His health failed, his body worn down by the ordeal and the sea voyage. He died the following year, leaving behind a journal that remains our most detailed record of the tragedy. Weber Hayes, the humble soldier who resisted Cornelisz with nothing but improvised weapons and raw courage, was the one bright spot in this story. He was promoted, praised for his bravery, and returned home a hero. His name is still remembered, carved into the stone fort that bears it, the oldest surviving European structure in Australia. And Lucretia Jans, the merchant's wife who had been assaulted, paraded and humiliated, returned to Batavia, scarred but alive. She gave evidence against her tormentors and lived on. History remembers her not for her suffering, but for her survival. As for the survivors who returned, they carried memories that never healed. Parents had watched children butchered. Children had seen parents hacked apart. Husbands seen wives dragged away. For the rest of their lives, they would remember the screams that haunted Beacon's Island. The smell of the blood on the coral sand. The gulls circling above them like angels of death. The Batavia was meant to be a vessel of wealth and glory. Instead, her wreck became a monument to greed, cruelty, and human savagery. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to this dark episode. Some stories in dark history are so drenched in cruelty that they feel almost unbelievable. The Batavia is one of them. We expect tragedy at sea. Storms, reefs, hunger, thirst. But what makes this tale endure isn't the wreck. It's the savagery that followed. Jeronimus Cornelisz turned a shipwreck into a kingdom of blood. He twisted hunger and fear into weapons, pitted survivors against one another, and slaughtered more than 100 souls, not for survival, not for necessity, but for control. Women were enslaved, children murdered in cold blood, families erased, and all of it happened not in the chaos of battle, but on a barren scrap of coral, day after day, under the pitiless sky. What stands out is the sheer human scale of it. You can read Pelsart's journal today and see the names, men, women and children, ticked off in the margin of murder. The terror wasn't abstract, it was specific, personal and methodical. And yet, there's another side to this story. Weber Hayes and his men, ordinary soldiers, abandoned to die, chose not cruelty, but courage. They built shelters, rationed food, defended one another, and resisted when it mattered. When Pelsart returned, it was Hayes' warning that saved lives and stopped Cornelisz from escaping with the rescue ship. On those islands you see the worst of humanity, but you also see the stubborn resilience. The Batavia remains a cautionary tale. It warns us that civilization is thinner than we'd like to believe, and that when rule collapses, some will choose brutality. But it also shows us that resistance is possible, even in the bleakest corners of history. Anyway, if you enjoyed the show, please consider leaving a review. It really helps us reach more listeners by boosting our visibility in the algorithm. If you think friends or family may enjoy the podcast, don't hesitate to share it with them. You'll find links to all socials below. I know ads can sometimes be a pain, so if you prefer ad-free episodes, check out our Patreon link also provided. Supporting us on Patreon is a great way to contribute. It's entirely optional. We also have a merch store, linked below, where any purchases greatly support the show and help us cover production costs. If you've been listening for a while and haven't subscribed yet, please do so. In that way, you'll never miss an episode. Thank you again for your support. So with all that out of the way, thank you again for listening. Join us next time for our next episode, as we delve into another event, and more dark history.